Hi there, it's me, Professor Charles. So I thought we would talk just very specifically about analogies on this video. This here is kind of a graphic I created for showing how when we reason, we're trying to show the connection between law and fact, trying to show the bridge between the two. And the two main ways of doing that are applying the rules plain language, that's rule-based reasoning, and then the other is reasoning by analogy. And so in this one, we're just going to focus on reasoning by analogy. And the first two slides of this PowerPoint, which is also in the Week 4 module, really is, they're just some pet peeves that I have that, that really aren't reasoning, or they're just, wrong. So read this here. I'll give you a second to do that. Okay, so this is about a release of liability, like when you go to the Lugnuts game, or you go to the Tigers baseball game, or any sporting event or concert. On the back is a release of liability. And so all of the examples in here are about a release of liability like that. But this is an example, a bad example of reasoning, because it's not actually an analogy. Throwing in just superficially, like in shoe, isn't an analogy. Okay, so look at your reasoning and make sure that you're not just doing some kind of superficial, topical relation to a case, or referring to a case. Okay, and then in this slide here, look at these first two examples. Like shoe, our release language is ineffective. Shoe is not italicized in the first one, so that means you're referring to a person. And then in the second one, like shoe, italicized, our release language is ineffective. So these are called false comparisons, because you're comparing in the first one a person, shoe, the person, to a release. That's a false comparison. You need release to release, or person to person. And then in the second one, like shoe, the case, you're comparing a case to a release. So those aren't the same thing. Case and release aren't the same. Now in all these examples down here, this is how you could say it. Like the release language in shoe, our language is ineffective. The release language in shoe is just as ineffective as ours, and so forth. So the four down at the bottom, those are good examples of how you would do it, comparing language to language. Okay, and now we're going to talk about some good techniques of reasoning. There's some good and bad in this one, but I'll give you a second to read that, and then we can talk about it. Okay, so the first sentence here is a decent way to begin an analogy. You're pointing out the main point, which is it's insufficient, and that's fine. I'm gonna show you a little technique here in a second for being a little more helpful, but that's okay. And then in the middle here, neither of the releases contain terms such as waiver, release, or similar language. That's the kind of detail you need to make a good analogy. You talk about specifically what's in common between precedent and your client's facts, or what is not like them. So this detail, that's the key. Detail is the key to really good analogies. Similarly, here is used incorrectly. You're not comparing it to anything, okay? There's nothing you said in the previous sentence that is now similar to what's in that current sentence. So that's just used the wrong way. Okay, and then one thing you want to look for when you reason is whether you're merely just repeating something that you already said above. So if you're just repeating a rule of law, that's not helpful to the reader. Okay, so make sure you're always applying it to the facts of your client's case in every sentence. So here are the techniques I'm talking about. Here's how you can ensure that you're doing a very thorough, helpful analogy. There's 4 points to a good analogy. And the first one here is you want to start by pointing out some concept in common between your precedent and your client's case. So here it's solely responsible. That's the thing that was discussed in the precedent, shoe, and the thing that you're trying to apply, the concept you're applying to your client's release of liability. So it's solely responsible. That's the concept in common. And then you want to compare. And here you're factually comparing it. In shoe, it said this, and likewise in ours, it says this. Okay, so that's a comparison. But do you see the detail there? It quotes things. It's very specific. It has what's in precedent. It has what's in ours. It's very detailed. The reader doesn't leave anything to the writer doesn't leave anything to the reader's imagination. And then if there are objections, and don't force this, but if there are objections, if there is something that just doesn't work between the precedent in your case, like it's too different or something like that, then be sure to point that out and neutralize it or do away with it. And at any point, you should pause the video and just really read this and soak it in. This is a really good example of reasoning by analogy. And I took this actually from a student paper who now is one of the best appellate writers in the state. And I fiddled with it a little bit, but this is just really good writing. But anyway, after you kind of downplay, then you state the conclusion again. And notice the first line, the language does not explicitly state that the holder is solely responsible. That's the argument. And you come back to it down here. It's not specific enough because it doesn't cover risk and injuries not part of the active game. So those are related. So anyway, you state the conclusion near the end, and it relates to what's in the top. Now, so here's a summary of those 4 points. And then I have examples on the next slides. And I think you just need to study them. Now that you've seen a good example, look at these good examples here. Here's starting with the concept in common. You can see how I just kind of build these. And then the comparisons. You'll notice the things in common among all of these is that they, oops, I went too far here. The thing in common among these is how detailed they are. Okay, they state the concept in common, then in detail they compare, they deal with any negatives, anything that's too different, and they state a conclusion. But the level of detail is fantastic here, and it's very clear what concept is in common. Okay, so anyway, there's some tricks for writing good analogies. Now take your memo, your first closed research memo, and look at your analogies. Do you have all 4 of those parts? Do you have a concept in common? Do you explain in detail the comparison? Do you deal with any objections or negative points, distinctions? And then do you state the conclusion? Make